What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back, everyone. This is Lee, and yes, today we'll be talking about the Sirui 16mm 1.2 lens versus the Sigma 16mm 1.4 lens. So, with all that said, let's begin. So right before we get started, I just want to point out that Sirui, they did send this lens over to me for evaluation. However, as usual, all opinions are my own opinions about the product. So with all that out the way, let's take a look at the price. So the Sigma 16mm f1.4 lens comes in at 500 USD, and that's just for only the Z mount. The other mounts are a little cheaper, but the Sirui comes in at 320 USD, and that's the on-sale price, but the retail price was 400 USD. So throughout this entire video, you guys need to decide if the Sigma 16mm is worth that extra $100 to $180 more than the Sirui. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at the specs. So the Sirui versus the Sigma, the Sirui is sporting a 1.2 aperture lens, whereas the Sigma is sporting a 1.4 aperture lens. We'll see that in the image quality test. These two lenses, they're 24mm full frame equivalent. Sirui has 13 blades, 9 on the Sigma. Sirui is offering 14 elements, whereas Sigma is offering 16. Sirui has 3 ED elements, 2 aspherical and 2 high refractive index glass, whereas Sigma has 2 aspherical elements, 2 SLD elements and 2 FLD elements, and I don't see any ED elements in that list right there, so that's not good for chromatic aberration. I can already tell you that right now. Also, the Sigma is offering weather seal construction, whereas Sirui do not have any weather seal. Sirui weighs about 384 grams, whereas Sigma weighs about 405 grams. So with all these specs out the way, let's take a look at the lens. Now the Sirui comes in 3 different flavors. I picked it the carbon fiber version, whereas the Sigma comes in with a high grade engineered plastic. Now as for updating your lens, the Sirui is coming with a USB-C on the rear of the lens, whereas the Sigma, they told me that in the future you'll be updating through your camera. So we'll see that when it happens. Now as for the lens hood, the Sirui seems to be slightly longer than the Sigma by 3 or 4 millimeters, so keep that in mind. Now with all the specs and features out the way, let's take a look at our first test. Now as for the first test, this is the Bokeh ball test. I want to point out that Sirui is 13 blades, whereas the Sigma is 9 blades. Also, I want to point out that Sirui, the balls are a little bit bigger than the Sigma because Sirui has slight focus breathing, so you kind of slightly zoom them just a little bit. And also the Sigma image, as we go down the aperture, the image itself seems to be getting slightly darker, so we'll definitely see that throughout this entire test, so please keep that in mind. Now as for the next test, this is the distortion test. Keep in mind, this is 16mm, 24mm full frame. Sigma has major distortion, whereas Sirui do not have that kind of distortion. So when you do autocorrection, you end up losing some of your image. So just keep that in mind. Now as for the bokeh blur test, the Sirui do have more blur than the Sigma, and that's due to the 1.2 aperture and also the slight focus breathing. So keep that in mind. Now as for the next test, this is the vignetting test. I will say that at the higher apertures, Sirui seems to have slightly more vignetting than the Sigma. Now as for the flare test, this is very subjective, but I will say that both lenses do have their flare, but I do like the Sirui a bit more just because it looks like a god ray, whereas the Sigma, there's a flare in the scene, but it's like a pimple or a dot. There's like no character to it. It's just there just to be there. But some of you guys may prefer that. It's very subjective, but definitely leave your comments down below. Let me know what you guys think. Now as for the chromatic aberration test, I'm shooting directly at this aluminum roof on a sunny day. And I will say, Sirui with their 3 ED elements, you don't get crazy chromatic aberration or any chromatic aberration at all, whereas the Sigma, unfortunately, 1.4, f2, 2.8, you get chromatic aberration, which is a huge bummer, but around f4, it kind of disappears, so keep that in mind. Now as for the next test, this is the autofocus test. I own the Nikon ZF, I own the Nikon Z8. I'm going to swap lenses on both bodies once the first test is done. And so with that in mind, you're definitely going to see the brands on top of the screen when I swap. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, you could look at my aperture. Obviously f1.2 is the Sirui and 1.4 is the Sigma. And I also want to point out that in this scene, there's a ceiling on top where the light is coming down. That's the maximum light I'm getting in the scene. When I get closer to the camera, I'm losing all that light, so keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to autofocus, I would have to say it looks more or less the same. Now, let's take a look at the swap. Now, here is the lens swap, and it looks kind of more or less the same. So in that regards, you know what I do on the channel. I have to make it harder to see the difference if we can. Basically, I waited a little longer in the day when things got darker, and here is the low light autofocus test in video. And as you can clearly see that the Sirui definitely has slightly more autofocus for the eyes versus the Sigma, which does a lot of box tracking. Now, let's do the swap. And the story remains the same. Definitely at f1.2, the Sirui, you get a lot of those eye tracking marks, whereas the Sigma is giving you the box tracking. And especially if you're shooting at the wide aperture, you would want eye tracking over the box tracking. Now, as for photo autofocus, good lighting is all the same, but here's the low light, and already, as you can see, the story remains the same still. 1.2, slightly more autofocus on the eyes, whereas the Sigma is giving you box tracking. Now, as for the video test, I want to point out that I'm using a variable ND by Nisi. This is the true color filter. It doesn't have a lot of color cast in that filter. Also, I'm 3 feet away from the camera, and here is my quick critique. Definitely the Sirui has slight focus breathing in the background, just a little bit. You could tell by the placements of the plants. The Sigma image gets slightly darker as we go down the aperture. Now, here is the landscape sharpness test. Obviously, if you have a 24mm, you will go out and shoot landscape probably. So let's break down by each section. Here is the left side. And I would say on the left side of the image, the Sirui seems to be slightly softer than the Sigma. Now on the right side of the image is the opposite. It seems like the Sirui is slightly sharper than the Sigma on the right side. And roughly around f4 is when things starts to even up a little bit in terms of sharpness. Now as for the foreground, it looks very identical. I think the Sirui might be a tad sharper, but definitely leave your comments down below. Let me know your thoughts. Now as for the center of the image, I will say that the Sigma at 1.4 is sharper than the Sirui, but around f2 is when things sort of kind of even up, but throughout the entire aperture seems to be very more or less the same in terms of sharpness. So just wrap things up, the Sirui versus the Sigma. Now we need to decide if the Sigma is worth the extra $100 or $180 from the sales price. And in my honest opinion, I think that Sigma is kind of out of date. That is an old lens. That's a 2017 lens. That at 1.4 with all that chromatic aberration, are you serious? And at f4 is when everything kind of evens up. You may as well just buy the Sirui at that point, right? Also, the distortion is kind of troublesome because that's not good for what you're paying for. You don't pay that much to get that. And I know a lot of you guys do autocorrection, but you're losing your image, the edges, it gets stretched out a little bit, right? Also, for the Nikon folks out there, if you're doing video in the future, you're planning to transition over to red, you may want to pick up a Sirui because you don't need to worry about the profile being embedded in the camera. Unlike the Sigma, they rely too much on software correction rather than the actual lens hardware design. So with that said, look up the Canon RF mount. When they had the RF mounts, and even today right now, not all the RF lenses is supported on the red cameras. So having the lens actually corrected right away without any software support is probably the way to go. So if you're planning to go that route, the video route, get the Sirui. Skip the Sigma because you probably need to wait for a long time for that, right? So that's a big bummer right there. Now, some of the pros for the Sigma is probably the weather resistant, the warranty, the vignetting, and that's it really. yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. If you want to pay extra just for those three, then go right ahead, right? The Sirui, it has excellent distortion control, bokeh, autofocus. There's more like characteristics on their flare, so you're definitely going to get something very interesting in your photos. There's a slightly longer lens hood on the Sirui, and it's even just cheaper than the Sigma. It's made out of carbon fiber for this model right here. So in other words, no one should be promoting a 2017 lens in today's climate. If they are, you should just skip their reviews and never turn your head around, walk away from that person, because 2017 tech, yeah, I knew that was 2017 tech. I knew it. And for those that don't know, that's 7+ years ago. That's crazy. That's wild. But anyways, thank you guys for checking me back. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely click like and subscribe, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next one, all right? Take it easy. Peace.